And what would face the nation be without a little political speculation? So that's what we're going to do now. Some brand new results from the latest CBS News New York Times joint venture, the 2014 Battleground Tracker. With CBS News Director of Elections Anthony Salvanto, Jonathan Martin, the national political correspondent for the New York Times, CBS News congressional correspondent Nancy Cordes, and CBS News political director John Dickerson. Well, Anthony, start us off. What's the latest news from Battleground Tracker?
Well, we went back again and looked at every state, Bob, and Republicans keep their lead. They'd be up 51-49 to retake the Senate if the election were held today. But, Bob, there's a couple of twists and turns on the road there. Let me tell you about one state in particular, and that's Kansas. Now, in Kansas, incumbent Republican Pat Roberts has now found himself in a deadlocked race with an independent candidate, that's Greg Orman. Now, you might expect in this environment somewhere you'd see an independent candidate gaining traction, but I don't think Kansas is ever a state Republicans envision having to defend.
Could the Republicans actually retake the Senate if they lose Kansas?
Yes, they could. The good news for the Republicans here is that they still have a lot of options. There's a lot of states they can win, and they're within striking distance right off the bat. But Kansas complicates things because, first of all, we don't know with whom Greg Orman might caucus if he is elected, and there's a lot of layers of this story, including fractures within the GOP there.
Nancy, you were out there. You were covering this race, but and I want to hear your thoughts on what's going on out there. But tell us what Anthony means when he says it depends on where he caucuses, because I think we all know what that means, but a lot of people out there may not.
Well, what it means is he going to work with Democrats or Republicans if he gets elected? And what he told me is that he will caucus with whichever party is in the clear majority. He thinks that that is in the best interest of Kansas, but that's obviously complicated because neither party may have a clear majority at the end of the night.
He may be the deciding vote there. And
as goes Kansas, so goes the nation.
Yeah, for the first time in the history of the world. But, I mean, what that means, though, is he will decide whether to vote with the Republicans or vote with the Democrats on how to organize the Senate, and that means on who they're going to elect as the leader.
Right, and Democrats, of course, are willing to take enough of a chance on the possibility that he might caucus with them that they basically push their own candidate out of the race to kind of clear the way for Orman to take on Pat Roberts.
You know, he may wind up, John, as chairman of the Foreign Relations Committee or the Appropriations.
He's going to have some opportunities.
He may plan that in order to.
He's going to have some good office space, Bob, I think, in his future if he
good
wins.
Parking place.
That's exactly right. I was in Kansas a couple weeks ago, too, and it is an unlikely place that you would have thought earlier this year could be shaping control of the Senate. But you've got one of these scenarios where it's a long-time incumbent in Pat Roberts who does not have a home of his own in Kansas, and an environment there which people are tired of Washington. He represents Washington in a lot of voters' eyes. And here's this independent with a fresh face and some deep pockets funding his own commercials who's saying, I'm not of Washington. I'm going to stand up to the R's and the D's. Now, that said, Kansas historically is a very conservative state, and Mr. Orman is now taking on a lot of negative commercials, so it remains to be seen if he can hang in there through Election Day. But the fact is, this scenario for Republicans of taking back control of the Senate gets a lot harder if they can't keep Kansas. It just creates one more seat elsewhere that they're going to have to pick up. It's possible, it makes it harder.
Yeah, just to look at the math, Bob, we know Republicans need to take 6 seats away from the Democrats. There are already 3 races in which the Republicans have pretty much got those locked in West Virginia, Montana, and South Dakota. That means they'd need 3 more seats before Kansas became a part of the conversation. Now they need 4 seats out of about 7 possible seats they could take away from Democrats. That's pretty tough because all 7 of those seats from which Republicans could pluck their victories are all tight as a tick.
And again, to go back to what this means about having this independent, the majority names the chairman of all the committees in the Senate. So this is extremely important. Talk about some of these other races.
Yeah, speaking of tight as a tick, we have a very close race, but the Democrat has now moved ahead, Kay Hagan, in North Carolina. This is one of those southern states, there's 3 of them, that the Republicans have been eyeing as possible pickup opportunities for some time. So we got Kay Hagan up now in North Carolina. But in Arkansas, the Republicans seem to have cemented their hold a little bit for now, with Tom Cotton up ahead of incumbent Mark Pryor. This is a race that the Republicans have been eyeing for a while, too. That makes them a little bit closer to that majority. And then in Louisiana, well, I think there's a real strong possibility of that going to a runoff, which could further delay knowing who's in control of the Senate.
And the reason you have a runoff on Election Day is because in Louisiana they do it differently.
Right.
They just take, everybody runs in one election, and then they take the top two. It's not a party. They don't have partisan primaries there. Everybody runs on Election Day. What's going on in Georgia? That's another close one.
Well, Georgia, you've got two people are running who aren't politicians, which is a fun part of that race. We don't have that anywhere else. And Georgia is one of those states that's, one of those battleground states, and where the question at the end of the day, if we've got 7 or 8 states that are very, very close, on election night, we may be looking and saying it was a horrible national year for Democrats. The president is not well thought of. The races are being run in red states, which is tough for Democrats. And the national issue set is all, for everything from the attacks, the ISIL threat to the VA, to the Secret Service. It's just bad news for Democrats. What may help Democrats and what to look for in Georgia and all of these states are sort of the sandbags on the levee, and that is their turnout operation. Are they finding the Democrats and getting them to vote, but also are they finding people who just don't vote in the past? They've put an unprecedented amount of money in all of these states, from Georgia all the way to Alaska, where they're flying planes landing on the water to find Native Alaskans to sign them up person by person. That's one thing we'll be talking about on election night if the Democrats hold off this onslaught.
Nancy, talk a little bit about the women's vote, because I know, for example, in Georgia, I think that race, in my view, turns on two things: a large black turnout and a large women's vote turnout. If those two things happen, I think Michelle Nunn wins. If they don't happen, I think she probably loses. But we're seeing that across the board.
That's right. And if you want to see just how important the women's vote is, go to Colorado. That's where we were this past week, where the #1 issue in the race to the outside observer would seem to be birth control. Senator Mark Udall is bringing up reproductive rights every chance he gets against his Republican opponent, Congressman Cory Gardner, because he knows he needs to run up the women's vote if he's going to win. He won by 15 points among women 6 years ago. He needs to repeat that if he wants to pull it out in this very tight race. 4 of his 10 ads have been about reproductive rights.
And there are gender gaps in all of these races that favor the Democrats. That's really what's keeping a lot of them close.
Right.
But it also speaks to how the Democrats have to maximize that turnout operation, because let's face it, these midterms are not being won and lost on anybody being rewarded for their recent performance. Certainly not. It's in neither party, really.
You can't underestimate to how central women voters have become to the Democratic coalition in the Obama era. This is the campaign for a lot of these candidates. You mentioned Colorado, but certainly in North Carolina too. It's a very simple matter of math. If Senator Hagan can get a certain percentage of the female vote, it makes it almost impossible for the Republican to win.
Do you all notice anything in your polling? I mean, my sense of it, based on no polling, is people are so kind of turned off by the whole thing that there's not nearly as much interest in these. It's always that way in an off-year election, but I sense less interest than usual.
Yes, there is. But for the voters who are going to turn out, there is a great deal of enthusiasm on the Republican side to vote against the president. And that is what's motivating the Republican side. And that's why they have this edge right now, because they tell us in the polling that they are more enthusiastic than the Democrats.
And that's the challenge for the Democrats. John mentioned their extensive turnout efforts, which is important. But the fact is, organically, if you look at the polling, the Republicans are just more excited about this election. And while there is no overriding issue that is driving this election, a la Iraq from a few years ago or the recession of 08, the fact is that for a lot of Republicans, the issue is President Obama himself. And they're going to show up and basically send a message to President Obama, Harry Reid to a lesser extent. And that's the best thing the Republicans have going. Look at what happened the day after President Obama's speech in Illinois last week. How many Republicans grabbed his soundbite saying that these issues are on the ballot and put that up on the air immediately? The Republicans want to make President Obama the issue.
Well, is there any polling that suggests that more people are going to the polls to vote against President Obama than are going to the polls to vote to show support for the president, Anthony?
Yes,
there are.
In each of these states, we actually find that the majority say it's more about being against the president.
Right.
But that is particularly true for Republicans. For the Democrats, it's about different issues, but it is not about the president.
Gallup poll has a poll out just recently that shows that those numbers, more people turning out to vote against the president than for him, match the way people felt in advance of the 2010 election. As you might remember, that was a very bad night for the president and his party.
And that's also why you don't see the president out on the campaign trail. Now, Democrats say he will make an appearance or two by November 4th, but as of right now, they won't tell us where he's going or when. You know who you do see out on the campaign trail a lot these days is Mitt Romney. Republicans all across the country asking him to come in and vote for them and work for them.
And the Clintons, for that matter, too, by the way.
Yep.
Yeah.
But when we were at an event in Colorado this past week, Mitt Romney was treated like a rock star. People were chanting, "Run, Mitt, run." So
do we
a bit of
really
vindication
think
for him
in
there.
the end that, I mean, I said early on, it seemed to me like he was sort of testing the waters here and that he might actually run. Let me just go around the table. Do you think he's going to run, John?
I'm skeptical that he does, but I think he's looking closely at Jeb Bush and Chris Christie. In fact, I talked to somebody this morning about this very issue on the way here, Bob, and they said if he looks at Jeb and Chris Christie and they either aren't running or they don't look formidable, he might make a late move in, which, by the way, would be a rich turn of events. Because remember, in 2012, Romney was plagued by Christie hanging out there for all that time, thinking about getting in.
And he knows that, and he keeps saying, the one who's the most attractive is the one who's not available. And that was the problem for him when he was running, and now he's benefited from it. One of the benefits of having him around, though, is it keeps Obama in the conversation in these races.
All right. Well, it's fun to talk about all this morning. I'm sure we'll talk about it some more, and we'll be right back.